There is a new book on Amazon.com titled From Malthus to Mifepristone, a primer on the population control movement. The book has 200 pages and another 30 pages of footnotes and bibliography. It has 233 standard footnotes, and it has blurbs upon and the website addresses of 137 of the modern population control movement's most prominent organizations. The bibliography also contains scores of references to academic papers, books, government reports, and newspaper articles dealing with population control. There is also a bonus list of 43 lists of population control organizations gleaned from the internet. Our population control movement dates to the 1790s. It began campaigning for the mass availability of contraceptives in the 1870s. It was establishing birth control clinics in poor neighborhoods over 100 years ago, and it was campaigning for the legalization of abortion over 90 years ago. As with all successful social movements, the population controllers have embedded themselves within the state. They have rewritten laws, and they have colonized sections within the health, education, and foreign ministries of many governments. Movement organizations come in several genres. First of all, there are the traditional population control movement organizations, comprised of persons who do verily contend that their homelands or the entire world are so severely overpopulated as to warrant immediate political intervention. These groups include many anti-immigration groups like Numbers USA. They also include some more enviro-science-based organizations like Britain's Population Matters. And there's a variety of election-oriented groups such as Italy's Mild Return, Switzerland's Eco-Population, and Sustainable Australia. Such groups are not the axis of the modern population control movement. They are certainly not where the movement's money is. In many ways, they are remnants of the late 1960s phase of the movement. That said, these traditional overpopulation hysterics organizations can command probably around several million supporters across Western Europe and the English-speaking world. Far more influential within the modern movement are the multilateral agencies fighting on the movement's global frontiers. The book could not possibly address all aspects of population control world over. When we refer to global population control, we are mainly speaking of the activities, the overseas activities of foreign aid agencies and philanthropic foundations headquartered in about 9 first world countries. These are the Anglosphere, the United States, UK, Australia, Canada, and 5 countries situated in northwestern Europe, namely Germany, Sweden, Norway, France, and the Netherlands. These 9 countries probably account for 95% of the donations going into global population control. The recipient countries probably number 70 or 80, and they are situated in Southern Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, the northern parts of South America, Central America, and the Caribbean. All in, this accounts for about half of the globe. There are many countries in Eurasia, in Latin America, and in the Islamic world which are not presently significantly influenced by the global population control movement. These countries have population policies of one type or another, but they're not presently within the main imperial population control loop. The book has historical chapters on Japan and China. The main donor countries, and again we're speaking of the English-speaking world and northwestern Europe, have very similar domestic fertility suppression programs. Namely, abortion on demand, usually funded by the state, liberally subsidized and comprehensive high-tech contraception programs, devious and much larger than realized sterilization programs, and these sweeping social engineering crusades led by the mainstream media and educational elites aimed at channeling sexual behavior towards non-procreative activity. These countries have achieved historically unprecedented low levels of birth rates, and they're hoping now to share their success with the third world. The major players of this international crusade are the World Bank, the United Nations Population Fund, the UN Population Division, the UN Commission on Population and Development, UN Women, and the World Health Organizations. These entities are mainly funded by the 9 foreign aid ministries of the aforementioned first world states. These foreign aid agencies also have their own programs that they operate directly. In both instances, the multilateral agencies or the foreign aid agencies, they tend to contract out the actual groundwork of their programs to about 24 implementers or government services contractors, and they have names such as Population Services International, International Planned Parenthood, IntraHealth, Mary Stopes International. Many of these contractors actually have annual budgets in the hundreds of millions of dollars. These are not small outfits. These contractors perform millions of abortions and sterilizations every year. They distribute billions of condoms and contraceptives, not only free of charge, but vigorously promoted with high-impact propaganda. Global population control's annual budget definitely exceeds $10 billion, and much of this is spent on services in countries where wages are a pittance. Comparable amounts of money are also being spent on the domestic abortion, sterilization, contraception, medical industrial complexes of the first world states. The term complex was chosen obviously to elicit the military industrial complex or the climate industrial complex. In every such instance, what we have is thousands of for-profit businesses and non-profit societies interacting with captured government ministries and compliant university departments to exert unwarranted and effective influence on government officials. The population control movement is unified. The aforementioned 24 or so government services contractors, which are global population control's workhorses, are, as I've mentioned, mainly funded by about 9 foreign aid agencies. These 8 foreign aid agencies and these contractors mesh together seamlessly. The multilateral agencies involved in population control, which mostly are revolving around the United Nations, also draw their funds from these 9 or so foreign aid agencies, and they also contract out much of their groundwork to the very same 20 or so contractors. So there's really only about 40 organizations that are the main force behind global population control. Of course, in their train, there are thousands of smaller organizations. The government services contractors draw additional funds from about 100 philanthropic foundations. This includes the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the Packard Foundation, Rockefeller Foundation, Ford Foundation, MacArthur Foundation, India's Tata Trusts, the UK's Wellcome Trust, etc. There's about 100 of these, and they are routinely issuing grants collectively to thousands of NGOs, agencies, and contractors engaged in some aspect of fertility suppression. The controlling minds of the philanthropic foundations, their executives, their boards of directors, play an obvious leading role in movement orchestration and interorganizational harmonization. They are in many ways the center of the entire movement, although not entirely. While we're on the topic of these philanthropic foundations, it's important to point out that many of the important technologies that are being used by the population control movement such as the vacuum pumps used in abortions, the IUDs, the contraceptive pills, the abortifacient pharmaceuticals, etc. These were not developed through normal capitalist investment processes. These technologies developed after decades of research and development, which was very expensive and often involved mass experimentation on poor third world women. This expenditure was undertaken by various charities, such as the Rockefeller Family's Population Council. And these charities were wholly motivated by a desire to suppress birth rates amongst targeted social classes and ethnic groups. A substantial chunk of the money flowing into the domestic and international fertility suppression campaigns is spent on these contraceptives and abortifacients and related medical supplies, which are now either wholly owned by major pharmaceutical companies or are licensed to them from the aforementioned philanthropies. In either event, the major pharmaceutical companies, Big Pharma, now play a key role in the overall complex. And these companies have all, we're talking Bayer, Pfizer, etc. These companies have developed their own philanthropic subsidiaries, their own academic outreach departments, etc. Along with Big Pharma, in terms of being a key player within the complex, are the gynecologists, both individually and through their associations. Across most of the first world, the abortions and a lot of the contraceptive surgeries are being performed by gynecologists. The gynecological professional associations cooperate very closely with Big Pharma and with the population-oriented foundations. These associations also undertake their own population control activism. The book has a chapter entitled Political Gynecology, which profiles several gynecologists who were A, fanatical population controllers, and B, towering figures within their own profession. Around 90% of the 1 to 2 million female sterilizations annually performed in the first world occur immediately after childbirth, or immediately after an abortion, or immediately after some other medical procedure. It's actually very rare for a woman in the first world to pick up the phone and book a sterilization. Almost all female sterilizations, and in the United States we're talking 700,000, 800,000 a year. These occur after these other operations, and they occur as the result of these well-honed, high-pressure sales tactics that the gynecologists bring to bear on their patients. The power imbalance between the doctor and the patient is a legally acknowledged fact. And the fact that so many of these gynecologists are deeply involved in the population control movement should have us all question just how really voluntary a lot of these sterilizations should be deemed. Back to the issue of movement cohesion. Population control movements, generally speaking, are of 4 or 5 types. They are statute-empowered ministries, government ministries. They are treaty-based multilateral agencies. They are duly chartered philanthropies, or they are incorporated for-profit or non-profit corporations. In all such instances, there is a legally required and clearly laid out power structure, a hierarchy within the organization of directors, trustees, senior managers, etc. In all such instances, this framework and who the people who are occupying these various positions is publicly available. What becomes very clear if you go over enough of these power structures within these organizations is that there are at the top a great deal of interlocking. There's a number of people, hundreds of people, who sit on the boards of directors of multiple population control organizations, or they are senior executives or former senior executives of major organizations who are also playing oversight or executive roles in other organizations. And we're really only dealing at the nucleus of this movement with a few hundred organizations, but they are tightly integrated at the top. Further movement cohesion results from the career trajectories of many of the senior personnel. Poring over the biographies of a lot of these people, there's a clear pattern which comes out where a person will spend several years at, say, a philanthropy like the Ford Foundation, and they'll move over to a major foreign aid agency, and then perhaps to an academic population studies department. They will spend their entire careers moving from one organization to another within the population control movement. What becomes obvious is that there is, in the higher to middle ranks of the movement, several thousand professionals who form a very tightly interwoven community. They know each other, they know of each other, etc. Another thing that brings the movement together tightly as a meta-organization are the joint ventures. Almost all of the major projects that are launched by the various foundations, agencies, or ministries are joint ventures with other foundations, agencies, and ministries. And these are usually announced with considerable fanfare. They're coming up with a new injectable contraceptive that's going to be low cost, etc. And they'll hold a public meeting, and representatives from the major organizations will be at the front table, and they're clearly operating in tandem with one another. And this is how most of the movement's new projects are rolled out. Closely akin to the joint ventures are these mega partnerships, which have names like the Reproductive Health Supplies Coalition or Family Planning 2020. These bring together literally hundreds of organizations in very structured coalitions. And then, of course, there are the conferences, which happen at the national, regional, and global level. There's almost an illusion cast because many of the major global population control organizations like UN Women, the International Society of Population Studies, etc., they hold annual or biannual or triannual conferences. These conferences can draw as many as 10,000 delegates. But if you really look at the chronology of it and the list of who's really attending these, it becomes clear that there are senior delegations from several dozen organizations that are attending one type of conference or another every 3 or 4 months. And these conferences provide optimal venues for inter-organizational harmonization and for rapid adaptation. Recently, there was an impromptu emergency conference called She Decides, and it pulled in about 1,000 representatives, and they raised an additional $500 million in public and private funds at this conference, which was called On an Emergency Basis. So it gives some example of the scale and the coordination of the movement. Then there's the fact that, that the movement is united by a common jargon. The professionals involved atop this, they speak their own language. There are differences of opinion as to how to move forward, and there are differences of rhetoric. But for the most part, it's really a difference in emphasis. Almost all of the organizations involved do this shotgun approach where they have multiple rationalizations and justifications for what they're doing, and they have default justifications and alternative justifications, etc. The mainstream government-funded sector within the movement has for their mantra sexual and reproductive health and rights, or SRHR, and that phrase or those initials appear in almost every paragraph of their writing. If you dig deeper into their literature, you'll find even the most politically correct government-funded agency will resort to old school Malthusian population control, overpopulation rhetoric as part of their justification. All of these groups, including the anti-immigration ones, will justify themselves as protecting us against environmental degradation, stopping climate change, alleviating women's oppression, alleviating poverty. They all use that rhetoric in their literature. And finally, the movement is united by a common purpose. All of these organizations, all of these individuals are dedicated to suppressing population growth, to suppressing birth rates, domestically and internationally. All of these groups accept that abortion, contraception, sterilization, and the mass re-engineering of sexual behavior are legitimate means to achieving optimal population levels. The point being is that the population control movement is a thing. It is a coherent collectivity. It is a social fact. It is an institutional federation of hundreds of organizations who have a collective annual budget literally in the tens of billions of dollars. They control scores of government ministries, or at least of sections of these government ministries. They control hundreds of academic departments. If one were to detail the influence this movement has on the mainstream media, one would have to write an entirely new volume, and that would be an eye-opener, I think, for most people. Despite the fact that it's an obvious social fact, even educated cynics tend to be either oblivious to the population control movement, or they are in absolute denial of it. This is partly attributable to the fact that it is such a large and powerful influence on culture that many people can't see the forest for the trees. They're effectively inside the propaganda bubble. And it's in part due because the movement's own propaganda, its own self-presentation, tends to camouflage itself and to prevent it from becoming an object of public discussion. I'm going to conclude with two brief comments on some of the more controversial aspects of this movement. In fact, on two topics: homosexualism and second wave feminism. Any analysis or discussion of homosexualism as a social movement risks provoking outrage from people who presume that the analyst is advocating persecution of homosexuals. But a social movement, homosexualism indubitably is. Homosexualism and transgenderism obviously predate sponsorship from the population control movement, but it was precisely this sponsorship which amplified homosexualism and transgenderism by great magnitudes after 1965. These sub-movements then leapt from strength to strength, securing seats within the commanding heights of the mainstream media and elite universities. The book compiles several smoking gun quotes from 1960s population control executives explicitly discussing the mass promotion of homosexuality as a core birth control strategy. Regarding second wave feminism, the population control movement is a misogynist, male-dominated affair that A, programmatically doubts women's capacity to control their own sexuality, B, cavalierly devalues women's consent regarding invasive life-warping medical procedures, C, rejects as a general human right a woman's right to bear children and definitely rejects her right to choose to have a large family, D, designs public health regimes wherein abortion, sterilization, and contraception devour the meager resources available for women's health, E, they rush ultrasounds to the underdeveloped world to facilitate female fetus abortions. Second wave feminism emerged in the 1960s as a subsidiary of the much larger population control movement. Betty Friedan, Simone de Beauvoir, Gloria Steinem, Germaine Greer, and others would have been completely ignored had their writings not so neatly dovetailed the fertility suppression agenda. Movement celebrities like Adrienne Germain, Nadif Siddiq, Joan Dunlop, Bella Abzug, Helen Gurley Brown, and others were but the ladies' auxiliary of an unabashedly male chauvinist oligarchic exercise in containment. This is not to say that all feminism, let alone all women's struggles, are derivative instrumentalities of reactionary elites. It is to say that there exists within the women's empower movement a tributary of agencies and characters whose overriding function is population control. I'm going to snap it off there. The book is available on Amazon.com. Additional information and a contact link are available at www.ecofascism.com.